Hi, y'all. So, my name is Emmanuel Cabrera, and for my complex problem, I wanted to talk about climate change. So, before we go on and we start talking about this issue and looking at the effects and maybe the things that people may not know and the solution, I want to first define what exactly climate change is. This presentation is guided towards people that may not know exactly what climate change is because there are people that don't know. And this presentation is also for people that may not know other solutions beyond the things that maybe they've seen on the news or maybe read on a website or things they heard on social media. So let's start out by first having a foundation of what exactly climate change is. So NASA defines climate change as, or it says, climate change describes a change in the average conditions, such as temperature and rainfall, in a region over a long period of time. For example, 20,000 years ago, much of the United States was covered in glaciers. In the United States today, we have a warmer climate and fewer glaciers. Nat Geo says that climate change is a long term shift in global or regional climate patterns. Often, climate change refers specifically to the rise in global temperatures from the mid 20th century to present. And then the Merriam Webster Dictionary says that significant and long lasting change in the Earth's climate and weather patterns. So, I want to talk about the effects of climate change. And there are people that think that climate change is just going to affect maybe how hot their summer is or maybe how cold their winters are. And climate change affects a lot more than that. So let's start off with what I mentioned before, which was climate. The UN states that the Earth is now 1.1 Celsius warmer than it was in the 1800s, which is about 34 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was before. It says, we're not on track to meet the Paris Agreement target to keep global temperatures from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre industrial levels. That is considered the upper limit to avoid the worst fallout from climate change. Another effect that people really don't think of is how are we as people going to adapt to this new situation? We as humans have never experienced something of this magnitude or have ever experienced something like climate change, don't really know how it is that we're going to handle it in these modern times. So the UN says that adaptation to climate change safeguards people from higher temperatures, rising sea levels, fierce storms, unpredictable rainfall, and more acidic oceans. So it's important for us to learn how to adapt to these situations, of course. But it says here also that some people are more vulnerable to these effects, such as those that are living in poverty. I remember in 2017, there was a big case going on in Europe, where there was a couple islands that were being affected by climate change because their islands were being flooded by rising sea levels, and so they had a huge geopolitical crisis because there were all these immigrants that were coming into their countries because they had nowhere else to go. So it's important for us to understand that even though there may be us who are able to maybe adapt to these situations, there are people that are left with nothing, that they're left with no homes, that will not know where to go. So that's another big impact that climate change can have. Another thing that can be affected by climate change is food and agriculture. And what's interesting about food and agriculture is the fact that it can not only be affected by climate change, but it can also affect climate change itself. The UN states that the unsustainable use of land, soil, water, and energy for food contributes to greenhouse gas emissions that cause rising temperatures. So we see the impact. And then it says higher temperatures in turn affect the results of produce to produce food. So now we see how it is that it is being impacted. So we kind of see the relationship between the two. And so the result is that up to 811 million people in the world face hunger in 2020. And it says as many as 161 million more than in 2019. Another thing that people may not think about is their health. People don't think about the fact of how much it is that this planet affects our bodies and how it is that climate change really plays a big role in that. The UN states that climate change is the single biggest health threat facing humanity. The impacts are already harming health through air pollution, disease, extreme weather events, forcing displacement, just like I mentioned before with the case of 2017, and the people that had to leave those islands. It says food insecurity and pressures on mental health. So we can see just how much of a health issue this can also be for us. So it's not just an impact of weather and things that are outside of our control, but also things that can affect us individually as people. It says every year environmental factors take the lives of around 13 million people. The final fact that I would like to discuss is nature. Um, the UN states that healthy ecosystems can provide 37% of the mitigation needed to limit global temperature rise. Damaged ecosystems release carbon instead of storing it. Like mentioned before, we are really privileged to be able to have these conversations, whether that be in a classroom setting or maybe via discussion board posts and maybe in different classes. But like I mentioned before, there are people that really do not know what climate change is, and I wish I could just say that it's a they don't recognize it, and it maybe has to do with political stances or whatever the case may be. But there are people in the world that really just do not know what climate change is. And for those of us who do know, or maybe have heard the term climate change, Massive Sign makes a good point, and it's um, we know the climate is changing, but the phrase climate change gets repeated so often that it's hard to remember what it really describes. It's not just the planet is getting hotter, it's that everything is changing. Like mentioned before, there are people that think that, oh, climate change is just going to be, hotter days and that's about it. But that's not the case at all. As we mentioned before, the effects of climate change are a lot greater than just saying, oh, it's going to be hotter. I can deal with that. Or, oh, I'm not really going to get winters. I didn't like the cold anyways. It's not just that. Climate change is a lot more than that. So it's important for us to educate people and allow them to understand that no, climate change is not more than that, that there are more factors and there are more things that climate change does affect. And I want to stress the fact that this is not just an issue that's in our own backyard, but there are people around the world that really do not understand or do not care about climate change. And it may not necessarily be their fault, but it may be because they're not educated and these discussions are not happening around them. And also, another big issue is the fact that there's a lot of misinformation that is spread. About climate change, such as says here that climate change is just a part of the natural cycle, which that's correct, but people don't talk about how much we impact it as people. That climate change is so bad that we as people find a way, that it just has to do with the weather, and also just really weird conspiracy theories that happen around climate change. I want to briefly also just discuss maybe a solution that maybe people don't think about when it comes to climate change, and it's simply eating local. People think that maybe eating organic or switching their diets to something more vegan will help with what's going on the planet, maybe by thinking that, oh, I'm putting less pesticides into the world or etc. But people don't think about their carbon footprint and how much it takes for maybe those ingredients that are more organic or etc. to get to their local market. And so let's say that maybe you don't have a farmer's market in your area. There are also other alternatives, such as eating with the seasons or cooking fresh food. Some people actually also make gardens. So there are tons of other alternatives that people could take just to improve how it is that they get their food. So this has been my presentation on climate change, and just a really brief solution on this complex problem because it's not so difficult for us to get involved. And thank you all for listening.